Well, if there was ever a morning when I'm tempted to move to another state, this would be it. When I'd want to move to Arizona or one of the other states that does not observe daylight savings time. I could have had that extra hour of beauty sleep, and Lord knows I need it. Don't laugh, some of you do too. We're glad you're here. Welcome to Westside today. Obviously, this is a day not only when we adjust our bodies to a different time reference, but a lot of our students are gone as spring break has begun for the university. A lot of our teachers as well associated with the university are out this week. So a lot of folks that are gone, but also we have some people that are visiting with us today. And we're just thrilled that you've joined us, delighted that you've come our way. We hope you'll come back every time that you have the opportunity and join us for worship here at Westside. I do want to mention this morning, I noticed in our bulletin that Cy and Bonnie Tilton this week will be celebrating their 52nd wedding anniversary. And we congratulate Cy and Bonnie. I don't know if Bonnie's here today. I didn't see her when I came in. I think Cy told me last week he was going to be out for a couple of weeks as he is traveling in behalf of the Ghana West African Missions. So, but we certainly want to wish them a very happy anniversary. One of my favorite programs on television is the Andy Griffith Show. How about you? In one episode of the Andy Griffith Show, Andy's son, Opie, makes a new friend. The new friend is a little boy from a neighboring town who is running away from home, headed to Texas. In fact, he wants everybody to just call him Tex. And Tex has all kinds of fantastic dreams about sleeping under the stars, rustling cattle, fighting Indians. But all of those dreams about running away begin to fade when supper time starts rolling around. And little Tex starts to think about his mama and daddy at home waiting on him. Finally, he agrees to let Sheriff Andy take him home. And as Andy takes him home, Opie looks up at his daddy and says, "You know, Pa, I've been thinking about running away, too. Say, would you like to come?" And Andy says, "I may just do that." Well, in real life, we know that running away really is no laughing matter, don't we? We know that in real life, running away is fraught with danger, heartache, and sometimes it can even be deadly. This morning, I want to go to Luke chapter 15, where Jesus tells three parables. Two of the three parables in Luke 15 are mentioned only by the gospel writer Luke. In fact, Luke in his gospel mentions 7 parables that are not recorded in any of the other gospels. The parable of the debtors, the 2 debtors, back in Luke chapter 7, or the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, the parable of the rich fool, the rich farmer in Luke 12. These 2 parables in Luke 15, the parable of the lost coin and the parable of the prodigal son. And then in Luke 16, the parable of the unjust steward and the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. All of these are stories that are not found in Matthew, Mark, or John. They're found only in Luke's gospel. And here in Luke 15, Luke has 3 stories that Jesus told to a group of Pharisees as well as some tax collectors and sinners who had gathered to hear him. Now, the first of these stories that Jesus tells is the story of the lost sheep in verses 4 through 7. And it is found elsewhere in Scripture. It's found in Matthew 18, verses 12 through 14. But then Jesus tells the story of the lost coin in verses 8 through 10, and then the parable or the story of the lost son, some would call it the prodigal son, that begins here in verse 11 and goes all the way down through verse 32. Now, I think the parable of the prodigal son really offers us a challenge today. Would it be fair to say that this parable of the prodigal son is one of the most familiar stories that Jesus told, at least to us? Is that a fair statement? I believe so. Most of us are fairly well acquainted with this story of the prodigal son. Many of us have heard countless sermons and lessons about this particular story. And so I can see where it would be very tempting, especially on a morning where we've already lost an hour of time. It would be very tempting for us to just put our minds in neutral and let's just coast through the Steve's sermon this morning and get this thing over with as soon as possible, right? I hope you won't do that. Because this parable may not be what you thought it was. Because you see, in fact, the parable is not at all about one lost son, but about two lost sons. One of them was lost in sin, but the other one was lost in his self-righteousness. And the parable really does not have a happy ending. I mean, we often think, well, the prodigal came home and they threw a party and everything was hunky-dory. Not at all, because the parable concludes with one of the sons still outside of his father's house. In fact, those individuals in the crowd who first heard this parable would have been so challenged. Some of them would have been filled with absolute ecstasy, and others of them would have been filled with absolute rage. Because it challenged everything. It redefined God, it redefined sin, and it redefined salvation. For those in the audience. So this morning, I want to ask you to please, I want to challenge you to allow this familiar parable to offer you a fresh perspective about God. We began by noticing a defiant son. Jesus begins here in verse 11 by saying that a certain man had two sons, the younger of which came to him and demanded his share of the inheritance. Now the younger son's inheritance, the younger son's share of the inheritance would have been 1/3. You say 1/3. Do you remember that under Jewish tradition, the older son would always receive a double portion of the inheritance? And so that older son, by virtue of being the oldest, would have received 2/3 of his father's inheritance. But this younger son would have received 1/3. But the problem comes with this. Keep in mind, very important, this boy, this young man, was not asking for a loan. He was not asking for an advance on his allowance. He was asking for his inheritance. Now, how do you receive an inheritance? Someone has to die. Someone has to die. Do you gather what this younger son is actually saying to his father? The disrespect that he is demonstrating? He is saying, Father, I wish you were dead. I wish you were out of the way, out of the picture. I want your stuff, but I don't want you. I want your stuff, but I don't want you. And it seems to me that that's exactly where a lot of people are in our culture today. There are a lot of people today in our world, and maybe even in the church, who are saying, God, I want your stuff, but I don't necessarily want you. I want your blessings. I want your favor. I want your kindness. I want your mercy. I want your grace. But God, I really don't want you. You just stay at arm's length away from me. Let me do my own thing. Let me run my own life. Let me call the shots. Let me make the decisions. I want your stuff, but I don't really want you. That's exactly what the son was saying to his daddy. I want your stuff, but I don't want you. Verse 12 is very significant. The father divided his wealth among his sons. The thing that's so interesting about that is the word that is translated here by our English word wealth is not the Greek word that normally would mean wealth. Rather, Luke used the word bios. Bios. Life. Biology, the study of life. Bios. He divided his life. Everything that he was. He just didn't divide his possessions. He divided himself. He divided everything he had worked for. He divided every effort of his life, the fruit of every bead of perspiration he had ever shed. Everything. He divided among his sons. And when that younger boy took his share of the inheritance and started down that road and disappeared over the horizon as the father watched, he watched a part of his own heart disappearing. It wasn't just that he gave him his stuff, he gave him himself. Do you know anyone today who is defying God, who has asked for their share of the inheritance and has turned their back and walked away? The second part of the story is a distant country. Jesus does not give us the name of a particular country or region to which this young man went. Obviously, that wasn't the point of the story. But I think there's a question that deserves to be asked at this point, and that is, why did this young man choose to go where he did? What was it about this distant country, whatever it may have been, wherever it was, why did this young man choose to go to a distant country? Well, first of all, there was a very poor promise. This young man was looking for something in his life. He was looking for fun. He was looking for happiness, for joy, for fulfillment, for satisfaction, for excitement. He was looking for something in his life which he couldn't seem to find at home. How often do we see that? I remember a story about a man who lived in a house on a hilltop. It was a very nice house, a very picturesque setting on the hills, beautiful valleys below, but yet the valleys were filled with danger, treacherous, raging rivers. But this man living in this nice house on the hilltop noticed that there was a hilltop far away upon which there was another house miles away in the distance. But every morning as he looked at that house, he noticed it had golden windows. And he thought, how wonderful it would be to live in a house with golden windows. I must see what that's like. And so one day he locked up his house and he began that treacherous journey down through the valley and across the rivers and in danger of the wild beast and all types of difficulties, until finally he traversed the valley and he climbed that hill to the other house. Only when he found it, it wasn't a very nice house at all. And the windows weren't gold. They were just clear windows. But as he looked back across the valley, with the evening sun now reflecting off of his own house in the distance, he saw a house with golden windows. And so often that's the way people are in life. We leave what we have for a distant country in search of something that does not exist. A man or a woman leaves their marriage, or they leave even their children for an adulterous relationship with another individual in search of a spark of youth or excitement or life that they think will bring some type of meaning into their life, and they find that it is only a hollow promise that brings years of heartache and regret. A person turns to alcohol thinking that it will solve all of the problems that they have in their life, only to realize that it creates more problems than it solves. And even some of our city leaders believe that. They think it's the answer to every economic woe that our community faces. We'll take it from one who has lived in East Arkansas the majority of my adult life. It does not. It's a promise that cannot be fulfilled. A distant country built upon poor promises, whatever they may be. Secondly, there was a perilous plight. This young man, can you imagine? A young man, reckless, careless, with a pocket full of money. Oh, he had a high time. He loved it. He visited every bar, every brothel. He had friends surround him. But then there came that evening when he told all of his buddies, "The drinks are on me." And then when he went to pay the tab, he reached in his purse and the money was all gone. And he turned around to see if one of his buddies would pick up the tab, and lo and behold, his buddies were all gone too. A perilous plight. A perilous plight that led to a pitiful picture. A young man in a far and distant country where a famine arose. When the famine arose, the crops failed. When the crops failed, the money dried up. There were no jobs to be found. And this young man found himself living in the streets, the back alleys of the city, huddling in the doorways at night in an attempt to stay warm, having to beg on the streets for any morsel of food he might find. What a pitiful picture. What a terrible sight. And then he found that there was a man on the outskirts of town raising pigs who needed someone to feed those pigs, probably feeding them the pods of a plant called a carob plant, husks that were not at all tasteful and not at all nutritious. They just would fill the belly. And he got a job feeding those pigs, and his hunger burned within him so deeply that he longed to eat even what the pigs were eating. That's what the distant country provided. Oh, it had promised so much, but it provided so little. And that's the way sin is, my dear friend. Sin will promise you more than you ever dreamed, but it cannot fulfill it. Think about, if you will, the precious promise that this young man thought of there in the midst of his difficulty. He came to his senses one day and he said, how many servants, how many hired servants in my father's house have enough bread to spare to go around? And yet here I am in this pig pen, wallowing, hungry. I will arise and go to my father and say, Father, I'm no longer worthy to be your son. Make me, now listen to this, make me as one of your, listen, hired servants. Hired servants. In any estate, there would have been servants that actually lived on the property. But there would also have been those servants who were hirelings. They were hired servants. They were brought in from the outside to fulfill a particular apprenticeship or a particular role. This young man didn't say, Father, make me one of the servants in your household. He said, make me as one of your hired servants. Make me the lowest of the low on the totem pole. Just as long as I can be within your sphere of influence. I don't even have to be in the house, Father. Just make me as one of your hired servants. That is all he hoped for. And so he headed home. Imagine the father. We don't know what kind of day it was. More than likely, in Palestine, was a day when the sun was hot in the sky. Maybe the father had finished his daily work out in the field and had come home to rest. But something attracted his attention to the horizon. And there, coming down the road, he saw a familiar figure. There was no hesitancy. This father did something patriarchs never did. You never read in the Bible of a patriarch pulling up his tunic so he could run, tucking it into his belt. But that patriarch ran down the road because he knew that was his boy. That was his boy. And when he saw him, the boy started to give that speech that he had rehearsed so often. Father, I've sinned against you. But the father wouldn't even hear it. He fell on his son and hugged him. Put his arm around him, brought him back to the house, called the servant and said, kill the fatted calf. That was something that was not done except on the most special occasion when honored guests had come. Put a ring on his finger. That ring would have had an insignia demonstrating that he was a part of the family. And put a robe on his shoulders. A robe? Yes. A clean, fresh, pure robe. Put them on his dirty, dingy, grimy shoulders, covering those filthy rags he was wearing. Cover him with my robe. What a great story. But there's one more part. there was the disgruntled son. Because as the people were making merry in the house over the son who had come home, the elder brother came in from his work, and when he heard the merriment, he asked, "What's going on?" And they told him, "Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf and put a ring on his finger and a robe on his shoulders." Oh, you would have thought the brother would have been ecstatic. Instead, he became angry. He wasn't interested in his younger brother. That little pipsqueak who had taken his share of the money, and now he was back mooching for more. And now, if he got more, that would cut into his brother's side of the inheritance. He became angry because he didn't want his brother to come home. He wanted it all for himself. The father came out and tried to talk to him, and he said, "Son, I've always loved you. I continue to love you, and what I have is yours. But we had to rejoice, for your brother was lost, and now he's found. He was dead, but now he has been made alive." And that's where the story ends. You see, the father came out for both sons. He ran down the road for the son lost in sin, and he went outside the house to talk to the brother lost in his own self-righteousness. And that's the nature of God. He reaches out to the sinner and to the saint. He reaches out to the person who's in the depths of despair and the depths of sin, and he reaches out to the person who in their own righteousness thinks they really don't need God after all. The question arises, where are you in this story? Where are you? There's some this morning that are here who find yourself in the shoes of that prodigal. You have defied the Father and you've gone into a distant country. You want to come home and you wonder, will God really accept me? This story is a beautiful demonstration that God does accept us. But there are some this morning who are here who think that we've got everything figured out ourselves. We really have no need of God, thank you. We've pretty much mastered everything in life, and we're pretty good. We're just pretty good folks, and we've got it all taken care of ourselves. But the fact is, we're in the same shoes as that other son, because in our own self-righteousness, we have forgotten our need for the blood of Jesus Christ. God reaches out to both groups today. If you need to come to Him, confess your faith, put Him on in baptism, we invite you to do so. If you need to come back to Him, we hope you'll do so while together we stand and sing.